In August 1945, over the skies of Japan, a belief quietly existed within the military command. The United States had delivered its final blow. Hiroshima had been wiped out, but many believed it was only a single strike, a trump card that could not be repeated. In meeting rooms across Tokyo, unspoken questions lingered in the air. How many bombs like that did America still have? Did they truly have the ability to continue? Or was this merely an act of intimidation meant to shatter Japan's will? As hesitation spread, the clock of war continued to run. And then, just 3 days after Hiroshima, another city awoke beneath the same familiar sky, unaware that history was about to answer everything. In 1945, the Second World War was moving steadily toward its conclusion on the Pacific Front. After nearly 4 years of brutal fighting against the United States and the Allied powers, the Japanese Empire found itself in a state of desperation. Most of its fleet and elite air forces had been destroyed, supply lines were exhausted, and many major cities had been flattened by American B-29 firebombing raids. Yet despite the mounting losses, the leadership in Tokyo still showed a firm resolve not to surrender unconditionally. They placed their faith in the spirit of death before dishonor, pinning their hopes on one final decisive battle on the home islands that might force the enemy to compromise. The slogan, 100 million deaths with the Emperor, was not merely propaganda. It genuinely reflected the prevailing mindset of determination to fight to the end in Japan at that time. However, in the early days of August 1945, an unprecedented threat appeared in the skies over Japan, an entirely new weapon that even the most hardline military leaders had failed to fully anticipate. It was the atomic bomb. Just days earlier, on the 26th of July 1945, the Allied powers had issued the Potsdam Declaration, warning Japan to surrender or face utter destruction. Tokyo ignored the ultimatum, still hoping to secure a conditional exit from the war, even relying on the Soviet Union as a potential mediator. But the United States was already prepared to use a top-secret weapon developed under the Manhattan Project to bring the war to a swift end. President Harry S. Truman made no attempt to conceal that intention. After the first atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, he issued a stark warning. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. That chilling message signaled that a terrifying new chapter was about to open for Japan. Under a morning sky that seemed deceptively calm on the 6th of August 1945, Hiroshima entered history in a way no city had ever experienced before. A massive mushroom cloud rose straight into the air, not from a prolonged bombing campaign, but from a single moment. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the B-29 Enola Gay released over the city, an object for which the world then had no adequate words, the atomic bomb known as Little Boy. In an instant, a massive fireball formed in mid-air, its blinding flash so intense that people several kilometers from the hypocenter were temporarily blinded. The heat released reached millions of degrees, incinerating everything below before anyone could even comprehend what was happening. A destructive force equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT spread outward like an invisible wave, crushing and sweeping away nearly the entire central area of Hiroshima. Wooden and paper houses, the familiar symbols of Japanese urban life, burst into flames and then collapsed like fragile models. More than 70,000 people died in the very first moments, with no time to run, no time to understand, swallowed by fire, wind, and pressure. The city sank into a nightmare beyond imagination. Those who survived carried horrific burns, many already exposed to radiation without realizing it. And at the same moment, Hiroshima vanished from the world of communication. No signals, no reports, no cries for help reached the outside. It was this silence that unsettled Tokyo almost as much as the explosion itself. News of the disaster did not arrive all at once, but in scattered fragments over the following hours. At first, the Japanese General Staff received only vague reports. A city had been destroyed by a large-scale attack, but by what kind of weapon was unclear. There were no detailed accounts, no images, only the complete loss of contact with a city that had once been home to hundreds of thousands. It was not until Japanese radio was forced to issue an official announcement that the horrifying truth emerged. Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb. This was something without precedent in the history of warfare. Even previous raids involving hundreds of B-29 bombers had never erased a city in the blink of an eye. The news sent shockwaves through Japanese society. From ordinary civilians to seasoned military leaders, all were left in a state of stunned disbelief, mixed with doubt. Could a single bomb really do this? Or was this an exaggerated account by the enemy? The question spread rapidly, carrying fear intertwined with suspicion. That very evening, on August 6, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters was forced to convene an emergency meeting to confront a weapon for which they had never prepared themselves psychologically. The meeting in Tokyo quickly revealed deep divisions within the leadership. On one side stood the peace faction, led by Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, who understood that Hiroshima was not merely a military disaster, but a historic turning point. They argued that the appearance of the atomic bomb had shattered all remaining strategic calculations of Japan. In their view, continuing the war under these circumstances meant dragging the nation down a path of total destruction. Foreign Minister Togo emphasized that the destructive power of the bomb used at Hiroshima was equivalent to that of thousands of conventional bombers, and that if the United States possessed more weapons of this kind, no defensive system could protect Japan. Opposing this argument was the hardline military faction, men who were not prepared to accept the new reality. The Minister of War, General Korechika Anami, responded with cold skepticism. He maintained that surrender at this moment was unnecessary, since there was still no conclusive proof that the weapon which destroyed Hiroshima was truly an atomic bomb. According to Anami, it was entirely possible that the Americans were exaggerating the power of this new weapon to spread psychological panic, or that Hiroshima had been destroyed by some other method that had yet to be clarified. In his mind, the possibility that this was a wartime deception could not be ruled out. This skepticism was not without basis. Before the war, Japan itself had conducted research into nuclear reactions, but had never advanced far enough to build a bomb. As a result, the idea that the United States could rapidly mass-produce atomic bombs remained difficult for many senior officers to believe. For this reason, Tokyo decided to seek answers not on paper, but at the scene itself. A group of experts and senior officers was urgently dispatched to Hiroshima to investigate firsthand. Leading the team were Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's foremost nuclear physicist, and Lieutenant General Seizo Arisu from the Intelligence Service. On the afternoon of the 8th of August 1945, the reconnaissance aircraft carrying Arisu flew over what had once been the city of Hiroshima. From the air, the sight below left the generals stunned. There were no urban boundaries left, no signs of a city that had ever existed. Before him lay a vast emptiness, like a grey, lifeless desert. No smoke, no flames, only a heavy silence that seemed to suffocate. Streets that had once been crowded had vanished entirely into a sea of rubble. The grassy areas surrounding the city were scorched and flattened in the same direction, as if a storm of fire had swept through and forced everything to bow down. When the investigation team landed and stepped onto the ground, the reality was even more horrifying. Bodies lay scattered everywhere, and amid the ruins were tens of thousands of wounded people, badly burned, wandering and moaning in despair. Faced with that scene, Lieutenant General Hideo Baba, the surviving local military commander, could not conceal his shock. He exclaimed that this weapon was devilish, far too brutal for human beings to use. In the span of a single night, Hiroshima had been transformed from a bustling city into a living hell. The following morning, Dr. Nishina began conducting measurements and scientific analysis. Drawing on his many years of experience in nuclear physics, he quickly realized that destruction on this scale could not have been caused by conventional bombs. The signs of radiation, the pattern of devastation, and the extent of the affected area all pointed to a single conclusion. This was an atomic bomb. Nishina determined that the bomb used uranium, precisely the line of research he and his colleagues had once pursued but never managed to achieve. His conclusion swept away the last remaining doubts within the Japanese leadership. The report sent back to Tokyo carried a cold truth. The United States had not merely issued empty threats, it had built, and had used, a weapon whose power surpassed every previous limit. And the most frightening part was not that Hiroshima had been destroyed, but the prospect that this might not be the last time. If the war continued, other Hiroshimas could still lie ahead. In theory, confirmation of the existence of the atomic bomb should have been a wake-up call, shaking Japan's leaders free from their remaining illusions. In reality, the opposite occurred. Instead of fully awakening, many hardline commanders accepted only half the truth. They acknowledged that Hiroshima was an unprecedented catastrophe, that the bomb exceeded all conventional weapons, yet at the same time reassured themselves that the United States surely could not possess many such bombs. In their thinking, Hiroshima was a special blow, not the beginning of a continuous chain of destruction. Immediately after the explosion, Japan's Supreme War Council plunged into debates more intense than any before. The 6 most powerful figures directing the war sat facing one another, no longer sharing a common vision of the future. The military faction, led by Minister of War Anami Korechika, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Soemu Toyoda, firmly opposed any proposal of unconditional surrender. For them, accepting the Potsdam Declaration at that moment meant admitting total defeat, something the Japanese military was not prepared to do. To defend this position, the generals advanced a key argument. The United States could not possibly have enough atomic bombs to strike Japan repeatedly. They believed the enemy might deliver one more blow, perhaps 2, but would then be forced to stop, and if Japan could endure that phase, the war might still continue. Among them, Admiral Soemu Toyoda was the most explicit. He estimated that the United States, even with all its scientific and industrial efforts, could likely manufacture no more than 1 or 2 additional atomic bombs in the near future. From this perspective, Japan could still steel itself to endure. More cities would be destroyed. Tens of thousands more would die. But in return, there would be a chance to prolong the war and wait for a political or diplomatic turning point. In other words, the Japanese military leadership was gambling the fate of the entire nation on the assumption that America's nuclear arsenal was limited. This was not merely a military calculation, but a gamble for survival, with the lives of millions of civilians as the stake. That belief did not arise from reckless bravado alone, but from how they understood the nature of the atomic bomb itself. In the eyes of Japanese commanders, building a bomb like the one used at Hiroshima was an extraordinarily complex, costly, and time-consuming process. They knew that Little Boy was the result of years of research and billions of dollars of investment. For that reason, they believed it was unlikely that the United States could produce a second or third bomb within just a few days. At the same time, the military continued to cling to a familiar doctrine, a fight to the death on the home islands. If American forces landed on Japan proper, the entire nation, soldiers and civilians alike, would fight to the last person, inflicting such catastrophic losses that the enemy would be forced to hesitate. Minister Anami and the army leadership even prepared plans for total national defense, aiming to turn an American invasion into a prolonged bloodbath. Before the cabinet, they openly declared that even if Tokyo were struck by additional atomic bombs, the military would not surrender, but would withdraw into the countryside, disperse its forces, and continue resisting over the long term. This readiness for sacrifice was cloaked in concepts heavy with the language of honor. Commanders invoked the idea that the fall of a fortress might require countless bones, implicitly accepting that millions of civilians could die if it meant preserving national dignity. Immediately after the news from Hiroshima, Chief of the Army General Staff Umezu even ordered strict control of domestic opinion, directing the arrest of any civilians who showed signs of spreading panic or weakening the will to fight. In the eyes of the military faction, fear itself was more dangerous than bombs. Yet it was precisely this extreme rigidity that made the peace faction increasingly fearful that the nation was being dragged toward a path with no escape. While Tokyo remained trapped within these flawed calculations, another event suddenly struck, completely altering the situation. In the early hours of the 9th of August 1945, just 3 days after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive against the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. For Japan's leadership, this was a strategically devastating blow. The Soviet Union, a country they had hoped would serve as a mediator, now became an open enemy. Japan suddenly found itself facing the world's two greatest military powers at the same time, from the East and the West. Even Emperor Hirohito could not hide his anxiety as he acknowledged that the nation had fallen into a situation of fighting enemies on two fronts. On August 9, the Japanese War Council met repeatedly in an atmosphere stretched taut with tension. The peace faction pressed for acceptance of surrender, with the single condition of preserving the emperor's position in order to maintain national stability. In contrast, the military faction continued to cling on by proposing a series of conditions, ranging from self-disarmament of the armed forces, to preventing Allied occupation, to retaining the right to try war criminals themselves. The two positions clashed so fiercely that every meeting ended in deadlock. The situation grew so grave that Emperor Hirohito was forced to break with precedent and intervene directly in the decision-making process, ordering generals and officials to present their views one final time. But while arguments in Tokyo remained unresolved, on the other side of the Pacific, the Americans did not wait. On the morning of the 9th of August 1945, the answer to all of Japan's hesitation, doubt, and illusion was already being prepared in the sky. At 11:02 a.m. on the 9th of August 1945, the sky above Nagasaki suddenly lit up in a way no one on the ground could comprehend in time. A massive mushroom cloud, rising more than 18 kilometers high, shot straight into the stratosphere, marking the moment the second atomic bomb in human history detonated. Less than 72 hours after Hiroshima, the United States proved that the first strike had not been an exception. The bomb, code-named Fat Man, was deployed not as part of a prolonged campaign, but as a decisive answer to Japan's hesitation. The mission's original target was the city of Kokura, an important military-industrial center. But war, as always, refused to follow a perfect plan. Thick clouds and smoke covered Kokura, preventing the crew from identifying the target visually. Fuel was running low, and time no longer allowed a return. The decision was made inside the cockpit to switch to the secondary target, and Nagasaki, a port city nestled among valleys, became the next name called by history. The B-29 Boxer, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, cut through the cloud cover and released Fat Man over a city that only minutes earlier had been living an ordinary day. Unlike Little Boy at Hiroshima, Fat Man was a plutonium bomb, with a yield equivalent to roughly 21,000 tons of TNT, significantly more powerful. In a brief instant, a blinding flash tore through the sky, followed by a thunderous explosion that shook the entire city. The ground heaved as if torn from its foundations, and nearby industrial zones and residential districts were crushed almost instantly. A colossal mushroom cloud surged upward, rising so high it could be seen from hundreds of kilometers away. Shockwaves and firestorms swept through the valleys surrounding Nagasaki, spreading rapidly along the terrain and incinerating everything in their path. More than 39,000 people were killed immediately, including Allied prisoners of war, and around 25,000 others were severely wounded. In just a few seconds, a once bustling port city was transformed into a sea of fire and smoke, where life was erased without the need for any further bombing. Later that same afternoon, news that Nagasaki had been struck by an atomic bomb was rushed back to Tokyo. For the hardliners, this was no longer a warning, but a second blow that shattered every remaining assumption. Hiroshima could no longer be dismissed as an isolated case. The American military had demonstrated not only that it possessed more than one bomb, but more importantly, that it was prepared to use them again. The belief that America did not have enough bombs to continue was incinerated the moment Nagasaki vanished from the map. Even Admiral Somu Toyoda, who only days earlier had estimated that the United States might have at most 1 or 2 bombs, could no longer deny the harsh reality unfolding before him. The fact that the United States had dropped 2 atomic bombs within the span of just 3 days created a terrifying impression in the minds of Japan's leaders and its people. That the enemy might possess an entire stockpile of nuclear weapons, ready to be unleashed on whichever city came next. Fear was no longer abstract. Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, these names were mentioned for the first time, not as cultural or political centers, but as potential targets of total annihilation. An atmosphere of panic enveloped the meetings within the Imperial Palace. The question was no longer whether Japan should continue fighting, but how many cities might disappear before the nation itself was erased. On the evening of August 9, the Supreme War Council convened once more, this time with Emperor Hirohito present in person. Faced with 2 successive catastrophes and the Soviet offensive in Manchuria, the emperor reached the decision that had been postponed until then, to end the debate. He issued an imperial directive calling for acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration for the sole reason of saving the nation. In the heavy silence of the meeting room, Generals Anami, Umezu, and Toyoda sat in stunned quiet. The pain and resistance remained, but reality allowed no further choice. Either Japan surrendered, or the country would face the prospect of total destruction. After that fateful meeting, the Japanese cabinet formally approved the decision to surrender to the Allies. Yet even then, the tragedy refused to close its final chapter. On the night of August 14, a group of extremist army officers, led by Major Kenji Hatanaka and Air Force Captain Shigetaro Uehara, launched a reckless coup attempt to block the surrender order. They stormed the Imperial Palace, seeking to seize the recording of the Emperor's surrender announcement in order to call for continued resistance. The coup quickly failed, but it revealed the depth of desperation and fanaticism that still persisted within parts of the military, despite the atomic bombs and the intervention of the Soviet Union. In the early morning of the 15th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was heard on national radio for the first time. In the imperial rescript of surrender, he acknowledged that the enemy had used a most cruel bomb, whose power to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the lives of countless innocent people. He made it clear that continuing the war would only lead to the complete destruction of the Japanese nation, and therefore he decided to end the conflict in order to save the people. Millions of Japanese stood frozen before their radios, many breaking down in tears. The brutal war finally came to a halt after 2 atomic bombs had taken the lives of more than 214,000 people, most of them civilians, leaving wounds that many generations would never fully heal. Looking back at the entire chain of events, the mistake made by Japan's military leadership appears stark and unforgiving. They placed absolute faith in willpower, in the spirit of Bushido, and in human endurance, yet underestimated something even more ruthless than the willingness to die, the scientific and industrial capacity of the United States. While Tokyo was still calculating how many bombs America might have left, on the other side of the Pacific, the machinery of war was already operating far beyond those assumptions. By August 1945, the United States not only possessed the 2 atomic bombs it had already used, but was also preparing additional ones. Declassified documents after the war show that the Manhattan Project had accumulated enough material for a 3rd bomb by the end of August, and that production capacity could reach several bombs per month. Just before Japan surrendered, President Harry S. Truman candidly admitted to a British diplomat that if Tokyo continued to hesitate, he would not hesitate to order the use of additional atomic bombs. This was not an empty threat. It was a reality ready to be carried out. If the war had dragged on for only a few more weeks, Tokyo, Osaka, or Kyoto might well have become the next names on the list of cities erased from existence. At that point, the price paid by the Japanese nation would not have ended with just 2 cities. Nagasaki, therefore, was not only a tragedy, but the most costly warning of all for those who still believed the enemy had reached its limit. It proved with brutal clarity that the belief America does not have enough bombs to continue was nothing more than an illusion born of desperation and stubbornness. Within 3 days, 2 cities vanished from the map, enough to end any debate over the possibility of continued resistance. But the cost of that awakening was immense. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost to demonstrate a truth that could have been understood sooner. In modern warfare, errors in judgment can kill as swiftly as weapons themselves. People may argue endlessly about the morality of the atomic bomb, but one fact cannot be denied. The obstinacy and flawed assumptions of Japan's leaders pushed their country to the very edge of annihilation. In the end, thanks to a decision made late but ultimately salvational by Emperor Hirohito and those willing to face reality, Japan avoided the darkest possible outcome. On the 2nd of September 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri, the instrument of unconditional surrender was signed, formally bringing the Second World War to a close. The war ended and peace returned, something millions of people around the world had waited years to see. But for Japan, that peace came at a terrible cost. 2 cities reduced to ashes, hundreds of thousands dead, and radioactive wounds that would persist across generations. The story, the Japanese Air Command believed America did not have enough bombs to continue until Nagasaki proved otherwise, is not merely a chapter of history, but a bitter reminder of the price of arrogance and misjudging an adversary. Nagasaki proved the opposite, and that very opposite reshaped the fate of an entire nation, while also defining the post-war world order. History turned the page, yet the lesson remains unchanged. In the age of science and technology, complacency and stubbornness can lead straight to annihilation, and peace arrives only when humanity is forced to acknowledge that there are limits of suffering that cannot be crossed again.